Okay.
Hi, I'm Lisa Atkins, and I was very proud to host a conversation really at Scrum Gathering, Scrum Beyond Software, about this topic. Scrum Congress, legislature, could it even happen? My sense is that I think I might want it, but I have no clue how it could actually be. And so a group of about 7 of us got together and talked about it. And we talked about a lot of the problems, the current impediments, basically. In contrast with transparency, opacity is kind of their value that we notice, and that the product is currently re-election, actually not really passing laws or whatever.
Okay, that sound actually was.
And that the law of unintended consequences is really evil and serious. But as we talked about these, we realized that these are no different than what we see in most corporations when we go in and work with Scrum or other agile methods. And just like the product is currently re-election for politicians, the product in a lot of companies that we see for managers is promotion. And we notice that Scrum can interrupt that and focus people on something different, a different product that has value for the company, or in this case, value for the constituents. So we then started to jam on this idea called what would be the minimal marketable legislation. And we came up with a couple different scenarios around that, asking the question, what would Scrum do? That's WWSD. So in scenario number 1, you get this big old piece of legislation, 537 pages, that someone would want to be jamming into the product backlog. But what would happen is that, because people know the rules and they're working Scrum, they would say, no! Break that down to the minimal marketable legislation. So what that is, by the way, definition, a piece of proposed legislation that is small, understandable, valuable, and doable. So what happened is this legislation would get broken down into minimal marketable legislation items, each one of which could, if it were important, could come right into the product backlog pretty high. Maybe this one is pork, maybe it's something no one really wants to do but got attached as a writer, so that one doesn't even make it. Maybe this one is pretty cool but it's low, so it comes down here. Then a number of sprints would yield that valuable, useful, small legislation stuff that is doable and understandable. So a note about pork. We had a really good conversation that writers and pork aren't necessarily bad, but it's hard to tell because they're stuck into other stuff that's unrelated. And when we break them out, we can see if they're useful or not. Better than that, because we break them out using the way we do it in Scrum, we might ask the question, who are the constituents that would benefit? And we get very clear about that. Maybe they'd actually have a better chance of coming into a future sprint because we'd see that they were useful for a group. That's one scenario. And then we started riffing on that and came up with another scenario. This is the scenario where the Patriot Act appears on every representative's desk at the same day. Boom! It appears, and then they say, we've got to vote this now. This is urgent. We have to pass this right now. And so if Scrum were alive in this way of working, what might happen is that a backlash occurs. All of these politicians, that's why they have little ties, all of these politicians would say things like, no way, we can't fit that into the current iterations, or it looks way too big, looks fishy, break it down. Or someone might say, hey, who's the product owner for this one anyway? And then the next step would be go to scenario number 1, which is the one we just talked about. So it certainly could be still very fast and nimble and all that sort of stuff, but would create transparency and momentum. We think it could be useful. And we think there are lots of other problems with it too. I mean, there's lots of other unsolved things. These are kind of simple, but I think simple ideas is where change like this starts from.